The Sherlock Holmes Advent Calendar. The Redeemer's Coming by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Nora Godwin. Narrated by Peter Silverleaf. 21. The Bearer of God. We stood in an underground, hidden room that was furnished like a hospital room. In contrast to the laboratory, which resembled a vaulted cellar, the floor and walls were tiled up to a height of about 5 feet, painted white over it. Also, attention had obviously been paid to cleanliness, even to hygienic conditions throughout. The lighting was astonishingly bright, putting into perspective that we were still standing in a room without windows. It was in fact so bright we were almost blinded at first. Tables and cupboards were tidy, medical equipment was properly stored. Even a water extraction site was built. Someone had put a lot of effort into providing all the needed comfort in this room. In the middle of the back of the wall stood a single hospital bed with clean white sheets. Holmes was the first of the three of us to notice that there was actually a human being in it. He quickly limped to his right side and bent over the supposedly only patient of this facility. "It's Maria Taylor," he proclaimed. "Quick, Watson, come here." Immediately I ran to the bed, and there she was. The face of this young woman actually resembled the drawing from Brother Emmanuel's Bible closely. However, it was clear that she was in a very bad state. Her breath was shallow. She was almost as white as a ghost and unresponsive. "Apparently she is in a comatose state," I said, grabbing her forehead. "She has a fever," I added. Then I carefully pulled out an arm from under her blanket and examined it closely. The lymphatic pathways are inflamed by an injection. I was able to further diagnose probably a blood poisoning, just as I feared. Holmes raised his right eyebrow and said, "Poisoned by the blood of Christ. God has a sense of irony. Treating this patient would make you famous, Watson." In fact, it could be assumed that a blood transfusion with whatever this sacred relic contained may have caused an infection, whether by fungi, bacteria, or simply by rust. All of those things were possible, especially after nearly 2 millennia of improper storage. If the infection would further spread to the bloodstream, the young woman would probably die, so I uncovered her to examine her further. Then I understood the whole frightening extent of our perpetrator's sacred experiment. "She's pregnant," I cried, touching her round belly. "She must be in her last trimester. This is not going to make the treatment any easier." "Of course she is with child," Holmes replied. "That's the point. She is pregnant with the new Messiah." I shook my head. "But how?" I asked. "You don't want to tell me that in this case an egg was fertilized by a blood transfusion, even if it was indeed of divine origin. So what has happened?" Of course, I didn't want to hear Holmes's answer, because I already knew it anyways. "The perpetrator provided for the conception," Holmes promptly declared, "in a very profane way." I looked at my friend in dismay and started, "You mean—" But I didn't dare say it. "Quite right," Holmes confirmed. "The perpetrator may have raped Miss Taylor repeatedly, as many times as necessary for her to finally be with child." "That's horrendous," I replied. "But how does this fit with the goal of this sacred experiment? In the end, the perpetrator only passed on his own genetic material." "Certainly," Holmes replied. "He had to accept that. But he based his approach on a false understanding of Mendel's doctrine of inheritance. The perpetrator probably assumed that the divine genetic material he had transferred through the blood into Maria's body would prove to be dominant. The fetus would develop one or the other characteristic of its biological father, but mainly it would be determined by the divine parts. At least, that's the abstruse theory." "And the mother?" I asked. "What role does she play? Why Maria Taylor?" Holmes also had an answer to this. "You told me," he said, "that Mrs. Taylor, Simon's mother, became pregnant with Maria when her husband had long since left the family. The perpetrator must have known this and therefore chosen her. In Maria's case, he assumed a virgin birth, which is extremely rare, but it is technically absolutely possible. Maria's mother probably insisted on this depiction." "That's right," I confirmed. "And with that, the perpetrator had everything he needed," Holmes continued. "An immaculate virgin, a future bearer to God. Ideal for his experiment with the blood of Christ, which he had planned for so long. I don't know yet how the perpetrator found out about Maria Taylor, but he was just waiting for her to get old enough. The fact that her older brother was also on a ship in the Northern and Baltic Sea at that time only made everything easier. However, the perpetrator had not expected Simon to return so soon, and certainly not for him to appear here in the Abbey, and only that is why the murder happened and consequently made us investigate." "To sum it up," said Lestrade, who had previously kept quiet in the background, "we are looking for a madman, and so far I only met one of them in the convent." But Holmes shook his head. "Brother Gabriel has nothing to do with the matter," he immediately said. "He would not be able to carry out such planned, complicated activities. No, we are looking for an intelligent perpetrator who not only proceeds systematically but can also act in the background. He has connections to the outside world, a great deal of knowledge, including medical one on a relevant scale. We are looking for such a man, but that will have to wait. Maria's health is precarious, Watson noted. Therefore, our most urgent task is to take her to safety first and subsequently to a hospital." "Holmes is right," I confirmed. "Come, Inspector, help me." Together, Lestrade and I lifted Maria out of her bed, using the lower linen as a carriage. Holmes had taken over the light source and the lead as we made our way back into the dark aisle. Although Maria had a delicate, relatively light body, we moved slowly and carefully to not bump into any walls or such. We reached the stairs leading to the lab and tried to climb up as calm as possible without causing any tremors. The last hurdle was the hole in the wall to the washroom, through which we had to climb out just as carefully. But when we eventually made it, we stood again in front of Brother Paul, who was somewhat surprised, but immediately helped us. Holmes checked to see if anyone was in the aisle, and when he gave us a sign, we rushed out, now a little faster, to bring Maria into our room. Luckily, no one came to meet us on the way, so we were able to progress undisturbed. When we finally entered our bedroom, we breathed a serene breath and gently laid Maria on my bed. Immediately, I assured myself that the impoverished ambulance had not harmed her. Her condition was unchanged, and we covered her up. "So far, so good," Lestrade said. "What now?" "Now we have to find the perpetrator," Holmes said. "But who could it be?" asked the inspector, sounding a little desperate. But before any of us could answer, Brother Paul spoke out. Apparently, he had only now seen the face of our patient. "Unbelievable," he said. "That's Mary, our missing kitchen helper." "But no," I replied, "that's—" But Holmes interrupted me with a clear hand gesture. Then he turned to the friar. "Are you sure?" he asked. "But of course," replied Brother Paul. "I should know. After all, I'm the chef. I worked with her." Holmes shook his head, irritated, and began walking around. It wasn't that easy, because we were 5 people crammed in our little room. So my friend soon stopped again and assured himself, "Are you sure? You're not confusing her?" "Not at all," insisted Brother Paul. "That's interesting," said Holmes, who then sat down on his bed and buried his face in his hands. Lestrade was even more confused than before. "What does that mean?" he asked. Holmes dropped his arms and looked at us with a serious face. "It means," he began, "that we were lied to, that we have been fooled for days. It is no wonder that the perpetrator has always been one step ahead of us, and it means, if I may, gentlemen, that we are quite utter fools." "Speak for yourself," said Lestrade. My friend ignored the remark and continued, "The fact that only the perpetrator knew that Maria Taylor and Mary were the same person was something that we have been lied to about. Only the perpetrator knew that, and thus we were blinded. He brought Maria into the convent when she was desperate and without any means after the death of her sheep, to the monastery, where she was promised a job with food and lodging only if she would introduce herself as Orphan Mary. She should presumably pretend to be a Catholic and deny her Protestant origins, so that the admission would be more justified. That would at least be a possible argument of the perpetrator, but in reality he lured her into these walls to make her the object of his experiment, to lock her up in a secret chamber, to inject the blood of Christ, and to impregnate her. Her sudden disappearance, which was planned for this purpose after some time, would be regrettable. But in this case, the monks would not further question a supposedly slovenly, already seemingly homeless young girl, except by Brother Emmanuel, who only came shortly after Mary's disappearance, but recognized or at least suspected a connection with his sister's fate. "An adventurous story, Holmes," replied Lestrade. "I don't want to have to prove it in court." "Don't worry, Inspector," Holmes said calmly. "The evidence to bring the perpetrator to justice is there. All we have to do is ask the right questions. Who took the supposed Mary into the Abbey? Who is the only friar with medical education? Who did not take part in confession or interrogation? Who has necessary access and authority? Who deliberately, falsely confirmed to me the authenticity of Brother Peter's confession, and who told us that he did not know the young lady in the portrait from Simon's Bible? That's our culprit." "I understand," I said, nodding approvingly to Holmes. "I don't," lamented Lestrade. "I do," Brother Paul replied. "Then fill in the inspector on occasion," Holmes told the monk, who kindly nodded to take on the task. "We don't have time for further discussion. Watson and I now have to set out to confront the perpetrator." "Shouldn't I come along?" asked Lestrade. "The perpetrator is, after all, a highly dangerous man." Holmes shook his head and took his revolver out of the suitcase to take it with him. "Exactly," he replied. "That's why you, Inspector, are so essential here. Your honorable task is to protect the bearer of God from him. Close the door, barricade it additionally, and open to no one but both of us. Do not hesitate to use the weapon should it be necessary. Miss Taylor's survival is of great importance and is an absolute priority. She is our main witness and evidence." With this, Holmes and I left the room, determined and armed to finally redeem the Abbey from their diabolical tormentor.